Declassified. 1941. Across the rolling fields of Wisconsin, a young man named Richard Bong walked the frozen earth with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He wasn't hunting for food. He was sharpening instincts. Every breath, every squeeze of the trigger, every heartbeat measured against the flight of a bird. Out here, among the pines and rivers, Bong learned something no flight manual could ever teach: patience, precision, and the stillness before a kill. When the war reached America's shores, that quiet boy traded his rifle for wings. He joined the U.S., the finer Army Air Corps Aviation Cadet Program, not out of hunger for glory, but for the same reason he had hunted. He loved the chase. His instructors saw it immediately. The kid from Wisconsin didn't fight the controls. He moved with them, as if the airplane were an extension of his own body. The military, however, was built on order, not instinct. And Bong had a problem with rules. At Hamilton Field in California, he met his first love, the P-38 Lightning. It wasn't just an airplane. It was a creature from the future. Twin booms of polished metal flanked a central cockpit pod, two roaring Allison V-12 engines driving counter-rotating propellers. The design looked alien beside the conventional fighters of its time. Kelly Johnson, Lockheed's visionary engineer, had built the Lightning to outrun and outclimb anything in the sky. It could soar beyond 400 miles per hour and reach the edge of the stratosphere. The P-38 seconds weapons, all four 50 caliber Browning machine guns and a 20mm cannon, were clustered in the nose. Unlike wing-mounted guns, which had to be aimed to converge at a set distance, the Lightning's firepower came together in a single, brutal stream. 1 second of accurate trigger pull could turn an enemy aircraft into confetti. But this monster demanded respect. It could climb like a rocket and dive like a falling star. Yet in those dives lurked a deadly secret. Pilots called it compressibility. At high speeds, shock waves locked the controls solid. Many men never recovered from that invisible trap. Bong didn't care. The sky was his playground. Reports in the base archives sanitized, stripped of adjectives, record unauthorized aerobatics over San Francisco. The truth was far wilder. On clear afternoons, people downtown would look up and see a silver streak roaring between the skyscrapers, looping under the Golden Gate Bridge. Bong flew so low over Market Street that pedestrians claimed they could read the serial numbers on the fuselage. His commanding officer, General George Kenney, had no patience for show-offs. Kenney was a tactician, a man responsible for the entire 5th Air Force in the Pacific. When Bong was summoned to his office, most assumed his career was finished. But what Kenney found wasn't arrogance. It was control. Behind the wide grin of that farm boy, he saw absolute mastery. Bong didn't break rules for attention. He broke them to understand the machine. Kenney made a decision that would alter the air war in the Pacific. Instead of grounding him, he would mold him. He ordered extra training, formation, discipline, navigation, combat drills, and then unleashed him into the most unforgiving battlefield on Earth. In 1942, the island was a nightmare of mud, malaria, and murderously short runways carved from jungle. The air was thick with rain and the smell of rot. The Japanese held the advantage. Their pilots were veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, seasoned killers flying the Mitsubishi, a 6-meter Zero, a plane that could twist through the sky like a dragonfly. It climbed faster, turned tighter, and seemed to defy physics itself. Allied pilots whispered that dogfighting a Zero was suicide. That's where Bong arrived, still barely 22, still with the smile of a farmhand who couldn't quite believe where life had taken him. On paper, he should have died within his first month. But Bong wasn't playing by the enemy's rules. He studied them. From the moment his wheels left the ground at Port Moresby, he observed every duel like a scientist. He noticed the Zero's pattern, how it bled speed to turn, how its light frame buckled under dive pressure, how its engine whined differently at altitude. First, never turn with a Zero. Second, hold the high ground. Altitude was his armor. Third, attack once hard, fast, and precise, and then vanish. In his first few missions, he rarely fired a shot. He was learning the rhythm of the Pacific skies, the slow rise of heat waves off the jungle, the flicker of light on metal, the split second where a shadow betrayed an enemy's climb. By the time he pulled the trigger for the first time, it wasn't impulse, it was execution. The Lightning's guns spoke with terrifying clarity. A burst lasting less than half a second ripped a Zero apart, scattering fragments across the canopy of the jungle below. Bong didn't celebrate. He simply climbed back into the sun. His reports were short, clinical, almost boring. Engaged 2 enemy fighters. Altitude advantage maintained. 1 confirmed destroyed. But what the paper didn't show was the transformation underway. This wasn't a reckless daredevil anymore. This was a tactician emerging. His peers began to notice his calm in chaos. The way he seemed to anticipate the enemy's moves before they happened. What others called instinct was geometry. Bong saw angles, deflection, timing. While most pilots sprayed ammunition in panic, he waited for that perfect instant when the enemy would cross the sight line. His bullets met the target not where it was, but where it was going to be. By early 1943, rumors spread across Japanese squadrons about a new predator in the sky. He came screaming from the sun, struck with blinding precision, and disappeared before anyone could turn to face him. To them, the twin-tailed Lightning was no aircraft, it was a demon. They called it Nino-O, the fork-tailed devil. To the Americans, that devil had a name. Richard Bong. He was still the same boy who'd once looped the Golden Gate, but now he flew with a chilling purpose. His aircraft bore a name painted beneath the cockpit marge. It was his sweetheart's name, a quiet promise carried into every mission. The other pilots respected him, but couldn't quite understand him. Bong was modest, sometimes awkward, often lost in thought. But in the air, he was poetry, every move deliberate, every dive calculated. New Guinea's skies were vast, and death came without warning. Yet somehow, Bong seemed untouchable. While others returned with bullet-riddled wings, or not at all, he returned again and again, his logbook filling with victories. 1 kill. 2 in a single mission. Then another and another. Each victory tightened his method. Each engagement proved that war, for him, was not chaos, it was mathematics. By the middle of that year, the US command began to notice the pattern. While the Pacific campaign bled men and machines, this quiet farm boy was rewriting the laws of air combat. General Kenny, watching from afar, realized the gamble had paid off. The rule breaker he had refused to ground had become a weapon of precision, a human scalpel in a world of sledgehammers. And as Bong climbed through the clouds of New Guinea, the sky itself seemed to bend to his will. He wasn't just flying anymore. He was hunting. By the time the tropical storms of 1943 swept across New Guinea, the legend of the fork-tailed devil had begun to take shape. American bomber crews spoke his name with reverence. Japanese pilots with dread. Yet to Richard Bong, war wasn't glory. It was a series of problems to be solved at 20,000 feet. Each mission was an experiment. The battlefield, his laboratory. He tested climb angles, dive rates, and firing distances until he could predict the enemy's reaction almost by instinct. The skies became a vast chessboard, and Bong never moved a piece without knowing exactly why. His first real breakthrough came over the steaming jungles of Buna. American bombers were under constant attack, their formations shredded by agile Zero fighters darting in from the sun. Bong watched, learned, and realized something simple but revolutionary. Speed and altitude weren't just advantages, they were control. He started every sortie high, always higher than the enemy, where the thin air made engines scream and sweat froze under oxygen masks. From there, he could dive at terrifying velocity, convert height into speed, and strike before the enemy even understood what was happening. In the instant, the target filled his gun sight. He squeezed the trigger for less than half a second. Then, instead of turning into a dogfight, he used his momentum to climb back to safety. A silver ghost vanishing into the clouds. His after-action notes were cold and efficient. Altitude, 21,000 feet. Engaged 2 enemy aircraft. Fired short burst. 1 destroyed. No damage. But the gun camera told a different story. Analysts back at base studied the footage frame by frame. Japanese planes exploding into fragments under perfectly timed fire. No hesitation. No wasted ammunition. A surgeon with wings. His squadron mates marveled at his calm. Major Thomas Lynch, another decorated ace, once said, "Bong flew like a machine that thought faster than any human." Others described him as unnervingly quiet, before takeoff eyes scanning the horizon, lips moving silently, as if calculating something unseen. And then, once airborne, he became pure motion. By February, Bong had already shot down multiple aircraft, and his superiors began tracking his growing kill count. But to him, numbers meant nothing. He flew for the mission, not for the medal. When new pilots arrived, nervous and inexperienced, Bong took them under his wing. He would stand by their planes before dawn, pointing to the horizon and whispering lessons about light, distance, and timing. That quiet mentoring saved lives. In an air war where most men lasted fewer than 10 missions, Bong's unit began surviving and winning. Then came the Battle of Leh. It was July, 1943. The sweltering air shimmered above the port city as a formation of Japanese bombers, escorted by a swarm of Zeros, approached Allied positions. From the foxholes, the sky looked like a storm of black dots spreading across the sun. High above them, Bong and his squadron were already waiting. Head climbed early, holding his men at altitude, forcing the enemy to look into the blinding glare. Through his canopy, the world glowed gold and white, the jungle below dissolving into haze. He could feel the vibration of both engines humming through the seat, steady and alive. Now, the P-38 seconds dropped from the sun like hawks, silver streaks slicing the air. The first Japanese formation never saw them coming. The Bong went straight for the bombers, the heart of the enemy formation. A single burst from his nose cannon tore into a Mitsubishi G4M, which erupted in a blossom of flame. Without slowing, he rolled left, climbed back into the sun, and picked another target. Below, chaos reigned. Zeros spiraled desperately to protect the bombers, but couldn't match the speed of the lightning. The battle was over in minutes. Allied observers counted multiple enemy planes falling in smoke. Bong's flight returned almost untouched. That engagement became textbook. The boom and zoom doctrine attack from above, strike fast, never turn, was now proven lethal. Bong had turned energy management into art. But success came at a cost. War transforms the man who wins too often. Bong's quiet intensity deepened into something harder to read. He wasn't arrogant, but he carried a distant calm that unsettled even his friends. Some said he flew like someone who had already accepted death. The Japanese, meanwhile, had begun studying him too. Intelligence reports revealed pilots were ordered to watch for the twin boom silhouette and dive instantly if spotted. But few escaped. The P-38 seconds raw power, its concentrated fire, and Bong's unmatched precision made him nearly untouchable. He wasn't a reckless duelist like some Allied aces. He was a hunter who planned every strike. To Bong, a dogfight wasn't a dance, it was physics. By November 1943, he had 21 confirmed victories. That number meant more than bragging rights. It meant dominance in an air war that had bled the Allies for 2 years. General Kenny, far from the front, realized what Bong had become. He awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, a medal for extraordinary heroism. And then, as command so often does, he made a decision Bong would hate. He sent him home. The war effort needed heroes. The newspapers needed faces. And America needed a story. A humble farm boy who had become a dragon slayer in the Pacific. Bong's image appeared on posters and magazines. He toured cities, shaking hands, smiling for cameras, answering the same questions again and again. To the crowds, he was a legend. To Bong, it was torment. In letters to his sweetheart Marge, he wrote of the hollow feeling behind the applause. "They cheer," he said, "but my heart's still out there with the boys." While others celebrated, he thought about the jungles, the sweat, the engines roaring at dawn, the quiet before the kill. He was restless, caged. The same restlessness that had once made him loop the Golden Gate now made him plead for a return to combat. He wrote directly to General Kenny, begging to go back to the Pacific. Kenny eventually relented. By March 1944, Richard Bong was back where he belonged, on the front line, under the relentless sun, with the smell of oil, sweat, and salt in the air. But the war he returned to was changing. The Japanese air arm had been shattered by attrition. The veterans who once danced rings around Allied fighters were gone, replaced by boys barely trained to land, let alone fight. Their aircraft were still fast, but their hands trembled on the controls, and Bong had a new machine waiting for him. The P-38 Jules, Lightning, a refined version of the aircraft he already knew better than anyone alive. Improved engines, hydraulic aileron boosts, cockpit heating, better reliability. The J was faster, steadier, more obedient, a weapon that could finally keep pace with the perfection he demanded. For Bong, it was a reunion. He had been forged once already from rule-breaker to weapon. Now he would be sharpened again. The sky, once his classroom, was about to become his proving ground. He had not come back to fight the same war. He had come back to finish it. When Richard Bong returned to the Pacific in the spring of 1944, he found himself stepping back into a world that had changed, and not just the war. The islands were still humid. The airstrips still strips of coral and mud. But the mood was different. The Americans were winning. Bases were expanding, supply chains humming, new aircraft gleaming under the sun. Yet the air still held that same thick weight of danger. For Bong, danger was a kind of homecoming. The P-38 Jules Lightning stood on the tarmac like a living beast, waiting to be unleashed. Its skin was polished metal, its twin engines upgraded with new turbo superchargers that purred like thunder barely contained. Hydraulic boosters had transformed its handling. It could now roll faster and respond instantly to its pilot's touch. For most, this was simply an improved airplane. For Bong, it was an extension of his body. The controls moved, as if anticipating his intent. But he had also changed. The months on the home front had left scars no one could see. The parades, the flashing cameras, the questions every smile had felt false. Heads stood on stages, shaking hands with generals and mayors, while in his mind he was still back over Leh, climbing through tracer fire. He couldn't sleep without hearing engines. Now, back in the war, he felt an odd calm. Flying was the only place where his world made sense. From his first mission back, it was clear the hiatus hadn't dulled him. It had refined him. His instincts were sharper, his timing perfect. But his opponents were no longer the elite killers of 1942. The Japanese Air Force had been bled dry by attrition. The veterans were gone, replaced by teenagers with a few dozen flight hours, sent up in hastily built Zeros. They were brave but doomed. For Bong, this wasn't triumph, it was tragedy. He admired their courage, even as he destroyed them. Each engagement felt less like a duel and more like an execution. The missions multiplied. Escort duties, fighter sweeps, intercepts. His kill count climbed with terrifying ease. 25, 26, 27. Each one documented with the same dry precision in his reports. But something new began to appear between the lines. Hesitation. He still fought with the same flawless discipline. Climb, dive, fire, climb again. But the exhilaration was gone. He'd look down at the smoking wreckage below and feel nothing but the same quiet emptiness. He'd felt back home, surrounded by crowds. In June 1944, during a mission over New Guinea, Bong surpassed the record of America's previous greatest ace, Eddie Rickenbacker. 26 confirmed kills had stood as an untouchable number since the First World War. Bong broke it without ceremony, returning to base covered in sweat and oil. The men cheered, slapped his back, called him Ace of Aces. Bong only smiled faintly and went to sit by the edge of the airstrip, watching the sunset burn through the palm trees. General Kenny, the same man who had once scolded him for his reckless flights, now faced a new dilemma. The boy he'd forged had become a symbol too valuable to lose. With 40 aircraft destroyed, Bong wasn't just an ace, he was a living legend. Every newspaper headline back home screamed his name. But Kenny understood how fragile legends were. A single burst of enemy fire could erase him in seconds. So the order came. Richard Bong was to be grounded. The reasoning was simple. His death would be catastrophic for morale. His legacy, however, could inspire millions. Kenny's telegram reached Bong's unit just after another victorious sortie. The pilots cheered the announcement. They wanted their friend safe. Bong didn't. He felt betrayed. His place, he argued, was in the sky, leading his men. Being pulled from combat was like cutting a musician off mid-song. He protested, pleaded, and finally bargained. Kenny compromised Bong could fly, but only on high-priority missions, only as a leader, and never in routine combat. October 1944. The target, Balikpapan, Borneo. The mission, escort B-24 bombers striking vital Japanese oil refineries. The enemy knew what was coming and threw everything they had into the air. The sky above Borneo became a maelstrom of tracer rounds, smoke and sunlight. Bong led his flight from above, using his favorite tactic, the sun, at their backs. When he gave the signal, his squadron dove, a wall of silver lightning splitting the blue. The Japanese formation shattered under the assault. But Bong's victory came at a cost. As he pulled up from his second attack, cannon fire ripped through his right engine. Warning lights flared red. Flames licked along the nacelle. The aircraft shuddered violently, losing altitude. Most pilots would have turned home immediately. That's what training dictated. Save the machine. Save yourself. But Bong wasn't most pilots. He shut down the burning engine, feathered the propeller to reduce drag, and hit the fire extinguisher. The left engine roared alone, the aircraft trembling under asymmetric thrust. He could still fly, and as long as he could fly, he could fight. He banked hard, dove back into the melee, and lined up on another Japanese fighter. The Zero filled his gun sight for a fraction of a second. One burst, then silence. The enemy vanished in a puff of smoke. Only after that kill did he turn for home, coaxing his crippled Lightning across hundreds of miles of open ocean. When he landed, ground crews rushed forward in disbelief. His aircraft looked like it had been chewed apart. The right engine was destroyed, half the wing scorched black, fuselage peppered with holes. They declared it scrap metal. Bong disagreed. He spent days with the mechanics, overseeing every repair himself, cleaning carbon burns from the engine, cowling, checking fuel lines with his own hands. Within weeks, the same plane Marge was back in the air. The word of that flight spread through every airstrip in the theatre. To the bomber crews, Bong became more than a legend. He was a guardian angel. Men whispered that as long as Marge was above them, no Japanese fighter dared strike. But legends have weight. With every headline, every photograph, Bong felt the burden grow heavier. The boy who once looped under the Golden Gate Bridge was now a myth in a flight suit. By December 1944, his record stood at 40 confirmed victories. No one had ever done it before. No one has done it since. General Douglas MacArthur himself signed the order. Richard Bong was to be permanently grounded. The decision was final. The ace of aces was done fighting. His last combat mission, flown on December 17th, was uneventful. No enemies, no shots fired, just the quiet hum of engines over the Pacific. When he landed, the airfield seemed unusually still. The ground crews saluted him, some smiling, some not. He took off his helmet, brushed back his hair, and simply said, "Guess that's it." The war would go on without him. But his mark was already written in the sky. Back home, he was celebrated like a national treasure. Newspapers printed his face beside headlines about the Philippines, late Gulf, and the slow death of the Japanese Empire. Yet when Bong looked in the mirror, he didn't see a hero, he saw a farm boy who wanted to go home. He had conquered the sky, but peace still felt impossible. In the months that followed, the military would find a new use for his mastery, a role that would take him into uncharted air, into the next great revolution of flight. But for now, the man who had once hunted through the clouds stood quietly on American soil. A reluctant hero surrounded by noise he couldn't hear, waiting for the next horizon to call him. When the telegram arrived with orders to end his combat service, Richard Bong barely reacted. Slipped it into his flight jacket and stared across the airfield where his P-38 Marge sat, glinting in the afternoon sun. The one place he had felt alive, 20,000 feet above the Pacific, was now forbidden. In January 1945, he returned home again, this time for good. The snow-covered fields of Wisconsin looked almost unreal after the steaming jungles of New Guinea. Crowds waited at the station, flags waving, brass bands playing the same patriotic songs Head heard on his Bond tour a year earlier. He had achieved the impossible 40 confirmed kills, a record that even the boldest pilots whispered about with disbelief. For every plane he shot down, dozens of American lives had been spared. But Bong couldn't shake the feeling that he had left something unfinished. Head survived when so many hadn't, and the question of why followed him like a shadow. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place in Washington. Under the brilliant lights of the War Department, Bong stood stiffly as Secretary of War. Henry Stimson read the citation aloud. The words were formal, bloodless, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Applause thundered. Cameras flashed, yet Bong's expression never changed. He didn't see glory. He saw faces, pilots who never came back. The president shook his hand and called him a credit to the nation. Bong nodded politely. He wasn't built for speeches. Head always let his flying do the talking. Then came a quiet February morning. The war was still raging in Europe. But Bong's world was finally still. He married his sweetheart, Marjorie Vattendahl, in a small church in Superior, Wisconsin. Snow fell gently outside the stained glass windows as they exchanged vows. For the first time in years, he smiled without restraint. Photographs from that day show the deadliest pilot in American history, looking almost boyish. Again, awkward, shy, happy. For a brief moment, life seemed ready to begin anew, but history doesn't rest for long. In the laboratories and hangars of Lockheed's Skunk Works in Burbank, California, a new generation of aircraft was taking shape. Sleek, smooth, and terrifyingly fast, the jet age was dawning. The P-80 Shooting Star was unlike anything before it. One engine, no propellers, just the raw scream of jet thrust propelling it beyond 500 miles per hour. The Army Air Forces needed the best to test it. Someone calm under pressure. Someone who understood how to learn a new machine from the inside out. Someone who had already survived the impossible. They called Richard Bong. At first, he resisted. He wanted to build a home with Marge, to disappear into quiet farmland and forget the war. But the lure of flight, the call of the unknown, was stronger than peace. He accepted, packing his uniform and medals away in a trunk and flying west to California. Burbank in 1945 was the center of the aviation universe. Engineers in white shirts and ties swarmed around prototypes like priests tending sacred relics. The smell of oil and ozone filled the air. Bong was no longer a warrior. He was a pioneer stepping into uncharted territory. The P-80 wasn't just faster. It was alien. Without a propeller, it produced no torque, no rhythmic vibration, no familiar cues. The controls felt lighter, the throttle response instant and dangerous. It climbed almost vertically, gliding through the sky with a steady, unnatural howl. Landing it, however, was a nightmare. Jet engines didn't spool down like pistons. They lagged, making timing critical. One mistake could turn a routine approach into disaster. For months, Bong studied it the way Head once studied the Zero patiently. Methodically, he learned how to manage airspeed, how to feel the aircraft's strange balance, how to trust instruments instead of instinct. He was, once again, a student. The Army soon assigned him to acceptance flights, final test runs before each new jet was handed over to the military. It was meticulous, repetitive work, but Bong approached it with the same quiet discipline Head brought to combat. Then came August 6th, 1945. The morning was clear and warm in Southern California. The sun climbed over the San Gabriel Mountains as Bong arrived at Lockheed Field in Burbank, wearing his flight suit and leather helmet. He greeted the ground crew with a small nod. The P-80 before him gleamed in the light, freshly painted and ready for its first official test. He ran his pre-flight checks carefully. Fuel pressure, hydraulics, flaps, trim, everything was perfect. At 9:30, he climbed into the cockpit and pulled the canopy down. The air was stifling. The smell of oil mixed with the scent of leather gloves. The jet engine spooled up with a piercing whine, building from a whisper to a scream. Bong taxied to the runway, gave a final salute to the control tower, and pushed the throttle forward. Within seconds, he was airborne, the California suburbs shrinking beneath his wings. At first, the flight was routine. Altitude steady, airspeed climbing. Then, without warning, the engine coughed once and went silent. Inside the cockpit, alarms blared. Fuel pressure dropped to 0. The main fuel pump had failed. Bong's instincts took over. He pulled back the throttle, hit the auxiliary switch, and tried to restart the turbine. Nothing. He was at barely 500 feet, too low to glide, far too low to recover. Below him sprawled a maze of houses, roads, and telephone wires. He might have saved himself if Head been a second faster. He reached for the canopy release, unbuckling his harness, ready to bail out. But when he pulled the lever, the jet pitched forward violently. The canopy jammed. Witnesses on the ground saw the P-80 roll once, trailing smoke, then plunge into an open field near Van Nuys. The explosion shattered windows for miles. Major Richard Ira Bong, America's ace of aces, the quiet farm boy who had once ruled the skies, was killed instantly. He was 24 years old. Half a world away, at that very same moment, another aircraft flew high over Japan. The B-29 Enola Gay released a single bomb over the city of Hiroshima. In a blinding flash, an entire city vanished. The world had entered a new age, the atomic age, and in its shadow, the greatest pilot of the propeller era was gone. News of Bong's death barely reached the front page. It was buried beneath headlines about the bomb, the end of the war, the dawn of something unimaginable. The man who had embodied the pinnacle of aerial combat was gone, and the kind of war he had mastered was already obsolete. In Wisconsin, Marge received the telegram while sitting by the window of their new home. She read it once, twice, then folded it carefully, just as Bong had folded his orders months earlier. Outside, the fields were golden with summer. Somewhere above, the skies were quiet. Within weeks, the war ended. Crowds filled the streets again, singing, cheering, celebrating victory. But for those who had flown with Bong, victory tasted hollow. His 40 confirmed kills, his calm courage, his impossible precision, these weren't just numbers. They were the legacy of a man who had understood flight as few ever would. in Burbank, engineers resumed their work, sketching faster jets, dreaming of supersonic speeds. Yet even among the roar of new engines, the story of Richard Bong lingered. To pilots, he was more than a legend. He was a reminder that mastery and humility could coexist, that perfection wasn't born from arrogance, but from patience. The jet age would claim many more lives, but none quite like his. For when Richard Bong's engine died, so too did the last heartbeat of the old world, the age of wings, courage, and the single perfect shot. Long before his final flight, the legend of Richard Bong had already become something larger than one man. Pilots whispered his name, not as a heros boast, but as a standard, an impossible bar to reach. He was calm, precise, and patient. Where others chased chaos, he hunted order, and in that order lay his secret. After his death, the Army Air Forces commissioned an internal study to understand how this farm boy from Wisconsin had achieved what no one else could. 40 confirmed kills, 200 missions. How did he survive when others, many just as talented, were falling from the sky? The answer, they discovered, wasn't luck or reflexes. It was doctrine. Bong's approach to combat could be reduced to a few deceptively simple principles, but behind those principles was a depth of discipline, almost mechanical in its precision. He didn't improvise. He calculated. He flew not by instinct alone, but by a mental geometry that turned dogfighting into physics. Rule 1. Energy is life. Altitude and speed were currencies, and Bong never spent them recklessly. While others burned energy in sharp turns or desperate climbs, he conserved his like a miser saving gold. He entered every engagement from a position of control, always above, always faster. Rule 2. Control the angle, not the chase. Instead, he positioned himself along the enemy's flight path, predicting movement like a chess master seeing 3 turns ahead. His gunnery was based on deflection, firing not at the target, but at where it would be half a second later. For Bong, it was muscle memory shaped by years of hunting in the forests of Wisconsin. Rule 3. Fire once, then leave. He never lingered in battle. The P-38, seconds 4, 50 caliber guns, and 20mm cannon could shred a plane in an instant, but only if the shots were perfect. Bong trained himself to fire for less than a second, then pull out before the enemy could react. He never lost a wingman following this method. Rule 4. Never turn with a 0. The Japanese A-6M was a dancer. The P-38 was a sprinter. Bong knew that if he tried to match their pirouettes, he'd die. Instead, he fought vertically. Climb, dive, climb again. He transformed the battle from a swirling horizontal duel into a brutal up-and-down contest of gravity and momentum. In this vertical war, the Zero's agility meant nothing. These 4 rules became gospel. Later, as American flight schools refined their curriculum, Bong's techniques were quietly written into manuals under the heading Energy Maneuverability Tactics. His personal style became the foundation for how modern fighter pilots think. His hit ratio was another mystery. Out of every 100 bullets fired, Bong's gun cameras recorded confirmed hits on target far above the average. He didn't rely on luck. He read the air. He could sense drift and turbulence through the stick, compensate for crosswind instinctively, and fire at just the right moment when the wings of his target filled the ring of his gun sight. Analysts studying his film footage decades later would marvel at its smoothness. Each sequence ended the same way an aircraft caught in the sights for less than a second, a short flash of light, and then nothing but smoke. No flinch, no wasted ammunition. This cold efficiency stood in stark contrast to the image the public adored. The crowd saw a hero. Bong saw equations. He spoke rarely about killing, often about precision. To him, victory wasn't destruction, it was mastery. Even his relationship with his machine revealed this mindset. Marge wasn't just a plane. It was an extension of his senses. Ground crews swore he could tell when the engine wasn't tuned right, just by the vibration through the seat. He'd climb into the cockpit, close his eyes, and feel the aircraft hum like a living thing. And yet, despite the legend, Bong was deeply human. Letters to Marge reveal a man wrestling with guilt and gratitude. "I don't fly to win," he once wrote. "I fly so the others can come home." In those few words lay the quiet philosophy that separated him from glory seekers. He saw himself as a guardian, not a killer. By 1944, his legend was already changing the culture of air combat. New pilots arrived in the Pacific, trained under Bong's doctrine. They were taught to fight smart, not brave to use altitude as armor, to think before they fired, to never chase a losing angle. The results were undeniable. American kill ratios began to tilt decisively. Historians later noted that Bong's greatest victory wasn't the 40 aircraft he destroyed. It was the countless pilots who survived because of the tactics he taught, the discipline he embodied. But his doctrine wasn't born from theory. It was born from necessity. When Bong first faced the Zero, the Allies were losing. They needed something radical to turn the tide. What he invented without knowing it was the first practical application of what would later be called boom and zoom, an energy-based system that transformed how pilots understood air combat. It was warfare as mathematics, and it worked. After the war, as the jet age exploded, engineers and tacticians returned to Bong's methods for guidance. When radar-guided missiles replaced machine guns, when engagements stretched beyond visual range, his core lessons still applied. Control the engagement, maintain energy, strike from advantage, and never fight the enemy's fight. In the sterile silence of modern air combat, where pilots sit behind screens and launch weapons from miles away, Bong's name remains a whisper. From another era, a time when the measure of a man was the steadiness of his hand and the calm in his breath. But the man himself never saw any of it. His death on the same day the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima felt like a cruel metaphor. The death of the old world and the birth of the new. The age of the duelist gave way to the age of the machine. In his hometown of Poplar, Wisconsin, they built a small museum in his honor. Children pressed their hands against the glass, staring up at the plane that once ruled the Pacific. Veterans visit quietly, some leaving their caps on the railing, others standing in silence. It isn't just a relic. It's a time capsule of an era when flight demanded both courage and intellect, when a farm boy could change the course of a war, not through luck or rage, but through patience and reason. General Kenny, years later, would write, "Bong was the finest fighter pilot I ever saw, not because he was the most daring, but because he was the most disciplined. He fought like a scientist and killed like a surgeon. And perhaps that was the truth of him." Richard Bong was not driven by bloodlust, nor was he chasing fame. He was, in his own quiet way, chasing perfection, the balance between man and machine, instinct and calculation, heart and discipline. In an age of missiles and computers, it will likely stand forever. His true gift was the example he left behind, a reminder that even in war, mastery is not measured by destruction, but by control. He showed that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply climbs to altitude, takes aim, fires once, and disappears into the sun. The sound of progress has always been louder than the echo of heroes. By the time Richard Bong's wreckage cooled in a California field, the world had already changed. That same day, across an ocean, the sky above Hiroshima burned white in one blinding instant. The weapon that would end the war also ended an era, the age of the dogfighter, the duelist, the ace. News of Bong's death barely made the front page. The atomic bomb dominated every headline. Somewhere, beneath those colossal words, Japan, city destroyed by single bomb, was a few short lines. Major Richard Bong, America's top fighter ace, killed in test flight accident. For most of America, it was a passing note. For those who had flown beside him, it felt like the silence that follows a gunshot. The last of their kind was gone. When Marge received the telegram, she sat by the window of their small home in Superior, Wisconsin, clutching it in both hands. Outside, the August sun lit the fields golden, and a warm breeze carried the scent of hay. She didn't cry at first. She simply folded the message carefully, as Bong had done so many times before, and placed it beside his flight gloves. The man she had married just 6 months earlier, the one whose name had circled the globe, was gone before his 25th birthday. The army sent officers to offer condolences. The local newspaper printed his photograph again, the same one used during his Bond tour, a clean-cut young man, smiling beside the P-38 Marge. But this time, there were no cheers, no crowds, no parade. That elusive prize for which millions had died finally came to America. But in the quiet that followed, the cost of victory began to reveal itself. In hangars from Okinawa to New Guinea, the once feared P-38 Lightnings were rolled into rows for salvage. Pilots who had flown them watched in silence as mechanics drained the fuel, removed the guns, and cut through the metal skin. The world had moved on to jets, to missiles, to a future that no longer needed men like Bong. Yet, among those who had served, his name remained sacred. To bomber crews who had watched his silver plane flash above them, he was still the guardian who appeared when the sky seemed lost. To the young pilots he trained, he was the man who taught them to think before they fired. And to those who studied warfare, he was the bridge, the pilot who carried air combat from instinct to science. After the war, General George Kenney, his old commander, mentor, and friend, visited Wisconsin to see Bong's family. He stood in their modest living room, his uniform pressed, his eyes weary from years of command. He spoke softly about duty and courage, about how Bong's calm precision had saved lives far beyond his own missions. He was the kind of man, Kenney said, you could build an air force around. Outside, children played in the yard, oblivious to the weight of his words. The next generation of fighter pilots, those who would fly Sabres in Korea and Phantoms in Vietnam, would study Bong's reports, his gunnery films, his tactical notes. His 4 rules, energy, angle, fire, discipline, became the foundation of modern air combat. Even the new jet pilots, racing past the speed of sound, carried his ghost in their training. They learned that control, not aggression, wins battles. In the 1950s, as the Cold War spread and radar replaced eyesight, his record of 40 victories remained untouchable. Missiles could strike unseen targets miles away. Pilots fought through screens and signals. The concept of an ace, a man who looked his enemy in the eyes, was fading into history. Yet, even in the new age of machines, the legend persisted. Fighter schools across America told his story to new cadets. Instructors would point to a photograph of Bong leaning against his P-38 and say, "That's what mastery looks like. Calm, hands, clear mind, no waste." To the students, his story sounded almost mythical. A farm boy with perfect aim, who looped under the Golden Gate Bridge, then rewrote the laws of aerial combat. But for the men who had known him, the myth was never the point. It was the humility that mattered, the quiet grin, the steady patience, the belief that war was not about showmanship, but about survival. At the newly founded Air Force Academy, a generation of pilots would read his after-action reports as case studies. Each one was written in that same restrained tone. Engaged 2 enemy aircraft, 1 destroyed. Between those lines lay the essence of American air power, to restraint in the midst of violence. By the late 20th century, historians began to see Bong's life as a symbol of something greater. The final chapter of the human era of flying. From the Wright brothers to the jet engine, aviation had grown faster than anyone could imagine. But Bong stood at the pivot point, the last ace before machines began to outthink men. In Poplar, Wisconsin, the town that raised him, people kept the memory alive. They built the Richard I. Bong Veterans Historical Center, part museum, part shrine, inside. The air smells faintly of oil and steel. The restored P-38 gleams under soft lights, its twin tails rising like wings of a metallic angel. Visitors can still see the name Marge painted beneath the cockpit. Children run through the exhibits, touching glass cases filled with flight jackets, medals, and photographs. Veterans stand silently before the aircraft, tracing the rivets with their eyes, remembering their own youth. And in the center of the room, a display case holds Bong's Medal of Honor, reflecting softly under a spotlight. Major Richard Ira Bong. 40 victories. 200 missions. 1 legend. It doesn't mention that he looped the Golden Gate Bridge, or that he died the same day the world entered the nuclear age. It doesn't need to. The silence of that empty cockpit says enough. Modern pilots, those flying F-22 seconds and F-35 seconds, still visit. They lean close to the P-38 and imagine what it must have felt like. The vibration of twin engines, the rush of wind past the canopy, the split-second decision between life and death. They know they will never fight the way Bong fought. Never see their enemies face to face. Never pull a trigger with their own hands. But they understand that every tactic, every training manual, every ounce of discipline they carry began with men like him. And somewhere above Wisconsin, where the skies stretch wide and the wind hums through the pines, the ghost of a silver lightning still seems to move. It dives silently through the clouds, turns once, and disappears into the sun. The legend endures not because of numbers, but because of what it represents. A time when flight was both science and soul, when courage was measured not by recklessness, but by control, and when one man's pursuit of perfection could define an entire generation. Richard Bong didn't just master a machine. He defined the limits of human flight itself, and though the jet age buried his world beneath noise and speed, his shadow still falls across every runway, every cockpit, every man who dares to chase the horizon. Because long after the sound of the propeller faded, the idea of him remained, that calm, disciplined voice whispering through the static, climb higher, see further, fire once, then vanish.